Richard, good morning, man. You had a good conversation with Morrilton shooting guard in the 2022 class, Joseph Pinion. What'd you learn in your conversation with Joseph, Richard?
Well, June 15th was the first day that college coaches could reach out to prospects in the 2022 class, and obviously a bunch of schools reached out to him, and he's added some offers, but I asked him about which schools were, staying in contact with him the most, and he said Arkansas and Ole Miss. It didn't surprise me about Arkansas, and they're just making him a priority like the other guys in the class. They're going to recruit you relentlessly, and I think he's starting to see that in a very short period of time.
Richard, just in your conversations with him and you kind of monitoring him on social media, how high do you think he is on Arkansas right now?
I think he's pretty high on Arkansas. He's an Arkansas kid. I think he's kind of grown up, rooting for the program, and I think at the end of the day, he'll probably be a Razorback, but can't guarantee that. He visited back in November and had a good time, and seems like he connected with the coaching staff pretty well, and I think his parents like Arkansas too. But if I had to wager right now, I would wager on Arkansas.
Richard, I thought you had a really interesting story, kind of dug into the football recruiting classes in the first year of the head coaches going back to Petrino. I thought it was a really interesting read when you kind of compared what's going on. What did you find as you went through the process of putting this article together, talking to Tom Lemming about how these first-year classes compared with the most recent head coaches?
Well, I think, for the most part, I don't think anybody would look at Bobby Petrino as being a great recruiter. He wasn't. It wasn't something he really loved doing. But if you look back at his first two classes, they were pretty impressive. And now he did inherit the best situation of all the coaches that I talked about in the story. He obviously Houston Nutt resigned and left the program, even though they struggled the first year. He did have some players. I think the biggest reason for his struggle was the style of play and everything. But then you go to Coach Bielema, and he had some good classes in the first two, and probably the first class is maybe one of the most impressive ones. And then Chad Morris, recruiting wasn't a problem with him; it was on the field. Mm-hmm. And then with what Coach Pittman did this last class, that was probably maybe if you consider all things equal, and he and Morris having to go through the early signing period, and being able to throw a class together, he probably had the most impressive first class of the four coaches of Petrino, Bielema, Morris, and himself. So I think that bodes well for the future. And when you're recruiting off a 4-8, 2-10, 2-10 season, there's not a lot to sell other than yourself and a vision of what the program will be in a few years.
So watching this 12 or so years of history here, maybe a little bit longer than that, going back to the start of Petrino, all of them had great recruiting classes in Class 1 and 2, and then it fell off and waned. Other than winning games, which obviously is a key to improving recruiting, what's the next big deal? Is it staff stability? What do you think is the key for Sam Pittman to have as good of or better classes his third, fourth, fifth year potentially down the road than he does in year 1 and 2?
I think stability definitely helps because they're already recruiting guys in the freshman class and sophomore class, and when you have a coach that's able to have a relationship with a kid for 2, 3, 4 years before signing day of his senior year, that definitely helps. And it's just continue to do what he's doing. I think he and Coach Morris had the similar type philosophy. You recruit him extremely hard to make it so hard, difficult for them to say no and make sure you involve the family. I think most staffs do, but you get to know the mom, you get to know the dad, you get to know the people that are important in that kid's lives. And I think Coach Pittman obviously has that knowledge of over the years of recruiting and knows what works and what doesn't. And I think they're going to continue to be a staff of assistants, and with him, a guy, a staff that recruits extremely hard, stays in contact with the kids, and there's never ever a time when the kid thinks, "Am I wanted or not?" And with nowadays, with prospects nowadays, they have to feel wanted. I think all people do, but I think this generation more so than any other generation.
Talking Arkansas football and recruiting with Richard Davenport here on the Morning Rush. Richard, on that note, he's learned from Kirby Smart, who's one of the best and highly regarded recruiting head coaches in the country. He's talked about it many times. You always got to be on. You always got to be recruiting. How much do you think his time at Georgia is going to help him recruiting at Arkansas?
Well, no doubt. He's mentioned that, talking about when he left Arkansas, he thought he was a pretty good recruiter, and then he went to Georgia, and under Kirby Smart, it was recruiting under steroids. Kirby obviously learned a lot from Saban. And when Saban got into the league, it seemed like recruiting just went to a different level. And again, it goes back to just being relentless and recruiting kids and staying in touch with them and doing all the right things and making sure that they feel like that they're wanted. And I think that, he was able to see for a few years how Kirby operated, and he's got some support staff members that came from Georgia with him. So that philosophy is definitely ingrained in him. From Kirby, so I think that is you're seeing a lot of what Arkansas is doing and what Alabama and Georgia is doing.
Richard, one of the guys that's really highly regarded on that staff, not from Georgia, but it's Justin Stepp, and he brought in 4-star wide receivers this past season. I know that they're on Keytron Jackson at Texas and a couple other guys right now. Just in kind of like the SEC and the confines of the Southeastern Conference, where does Justin Stepp rank as a recruiter, especially at his position, coach in the SEC?
I would tend to think the upper tier, just because what he did at Arkansas in the first couple of years, he was doing it with not much to sell other than what I said earlier, vision and obviously he being able to build relationships and trust with the kids. Mm-hmm. I think he would definitely be upper tier.
Talking with Richard Davenport here on the Morning Rush. Richard, when you look at some of the other, Justin Stepp has been highly regarded, like we're just talking about, and you mentioned bringing numbers of guys. I know Scott Fountain, the new special teams coordinator, some other guys that he's brought over from Georgia. Who do you think is going to make some noise in this upcoming recruiting class as far as that goes?
That's a good question. It's early. It's kind of early in the process, but you definitely, when you talk to kids that about certain members of the staff, Sam Carter is definitely one of them that you hear a lot of good things about. Barry Odom, and I'm going to sound like I'm I'm saying every member of the staff, but when you constantly hear the same thing about a coach through the years of doing this, you realize who's really really enjoys the process and who's really a natural at recruiting, and I think he is definitely one of them. Ryan Rhodes is pretty good. Talking to some of the kids and some of the parents that I talked to, Kendall Briles obviously is well respected. I think Brad Davis is going to be an excellent recruiter and has already shown that. And Jimmy Smith, especially, we talked about him very early when he was hired on. His reputation in the state of Georgia is impeccable. Anybody you talk to in the state of Georgia, they're going to rave about him. And the kids also, when you talk about him, just says that he knows how to relate to them, and he gains that trust. And that's the number one thing when you're recruiting. if you're a coach, and any of these coaches that I just talked about, John Cooper, throw him in there. I'm excited to see what this staff can do 2 to 3 years from now. But it's all about trust and gaining that trust and knowing that what that coach says is the truth.
I found one of the Tom Lemming quotes in your article kind of interesting from the standpoint of the level or the time commitment to recruiting in the SEC versus the Big Ten, and maybe Bielema and his staff never fully grasped that. We've seen what appears to be, at least from a social media and outward perspective, in basketball, Musselman's taken the focus and the time commitment to recruiting to a higher level than what Anderson had it. I think Sam Pittman's going to get that too. We referenced earlier his time with Kirby Smart and that time with Alabama that traces back to there. I think it's pretty clear, Richard, and I'd like your thoughts on this, that Sam Pittman and his staff understand the time commitment versus what Bielema and his staff are putting into recruiting, and it continues to ratchet up every year in the SEC.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you have SEC experience, I think that definitely helps, because you know it's a dog eat dog world, and it's the SEC is the most relentless, and it can be the most negative recruiting conference in the country. I mean, I think Coach Muss has even hit on that a little bit, talking about how it's a different conference when it comes to recruiting, and I think that you're not going to have anybody outwork Coach Pittman and this staff, and Coach Muss too. And I think that's why I think that they'll be successful, because at Arkansas you must work relentlessly, because you don't have the in-state talent base that most of the other schools have. So most of your 2/3 of your class pretty much is coming from out of state. So you got to be on the phone, and you got to be on Twitter at all times, because those kids, they're being told how great the University of Georgia is, Florida is, Alabama, University of Texas. They're very seldom ever hearing the word about Arkansas. So you got to be able to sell them on that and get all those in-state schools where they live out of their mind, and get Arkansas focused on them. So, and I will say one thing about Brett Bielema. He was the first coach to bring in graphics, and I think that that he did have that philosophy, and he brought that to Arkansas, and he was the first one to implement graphics in recruiting.
You should talk about these recruiting battles. It's part of what fuels these rivalries, and I don't think we quite get it here in Arkansas because we don't have a conference foe in our state. But I mean, you see it. Alabama and Auburn compete over a kid in recruiting just as hard as they do on the field in the Iron Bowl, and this goes on in the state of Mississippi and other places around the league. I think maybe that would help fuel this rivalry that's being crammed down our throats with Missouri. If Arkansas and Missouri both battled for kids, and I guess the only one you've really seen a great battle was for Dorial Green Beckham, but these battles in recruiting, I think, are paid attention a lot more to in these other places where it's just as entertaining to fans in the offseason watching the recruiting battles as it is the games on the field.
Yeah, if you don't have an in-state rival like in Alabama and Auburn, or even Georgia Tech, Florida State, Texas A&M, I think sometimes Arkansas fans don't understand the intensity of hate that those schools have for one another, and that definitely bleeds over to recruiting.
Richard Davenport of the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette joins us every Thursday for a Recruiting Thursday. Richard, appreciate the time this morning, man. Have a great weekend as always. We'll talk to you next Thursday.
All right, buddy. We'll see you guys.